In Chapter 17, we explore the theme of how the economy in the United States transitioned from agriculture to industry after the Civil War. And one of the things that we see here is that agriculture remained an important industry up through the 1880s. And then after that, we see industry growing as the number of consumers are growing, as the markets become more unified in the United States. And so you get the development of national businesses, first with the railroads being among the first large businesses, national businesses in the United States. And then you see other large corporations like Standard Oil, like U.S. Steel, all developing in the final decades of the 1800s. And as they do, they work to get monopoly power. And they work to have pricing power. And they do this through mergers and acquisitions. And that's the theme of this chapter. So what this time period represents, the closing decades represent the Second Industrial Revolution, where we've already talked about we had a national railroad that was built, we had a national telegraph system that existed. But you also have a time in the same time period where businesses are organizing themselves in new ways, innovative ways, such that you have investments in capital, you have the developments of new methods, the incorporation of new technology into the businesses such that you get productivity increases. And those productivity increases become critical to the United States economy growing. That's how you get a developing economy to become a developed economy, is through those productivity increases. And so this is all happening as the Civil War has ended, as the debt from that war is being paid off, and the United States is in the final decades of being a developing country and transitioning to a developed country. Now, one of the things that's pushing these companies to be able to do more, to be more productive, is that we have new sources of energy. We've got the steam engine becoming incredibly important, not only for rail, but also just within the factory system. These steam engines are also part of how electricity is generated. And that electrical system, which comes about in the 1880s and especially the 1890s and 1900, largely in the urban areas, that electricity becomes the source of power within most businesses. And that steam is generated by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. That's all being used to generate the steam that generates the energy and the electric that's needed. Within these factories, you've got, again, those new methods. Those new methods meaning you've got continuous flow and scientific management. Continuous flow means they were basically always bringing in materials into the factory, and they're in constant movement in their conversion from an input good, a commodity, to an output good, a final good. And then you've got scientific management. These are the business procedures to carry out the production process. Even simple things like certain cost accounting procedures, time clocks, HR policies, all of these things are what we take as a given in today's business environment, but they had to be developed, and they're developed in this time period. You also get Taylorism, where you have worker efficiency, where workers have a defined set of practices and they do those tasks to greater efficiency and become more specialized and experts in their realm. And railroads end up becoming, because they are the biggest industry, is the one that embraces all of these forms of mass production. This isn't just a Henry Ford, building of the Model T kind of experience. You see it much earlier than the Ford Motor Company existed. And you see this in the closing decades of the 1800s in the railroads, and more specifically, Union Pacific. What becomes clear to the businesses is that what's needed is to have single companies or very small number of companies serve the several larger market of consumers, because then and only then do you get the economies of scale, producing a large amount of product. And by getting those economies of scale, you lower your average total cost low enough that you can earn more profit. Now, how do you do this? How do you get a really big market where you're earning a profit? How do you stop other companies from getting in there and competing against you? Well, one way you could do it is with a simple what's called gentleman's agreement. And in that gentleman's agreement, what you would do is you'd get all the leaders of those companies together in a room, and you would say, these are the prices we're going to charge. If you don't charge that price, we're going to be collectively very mean to you and do bad things to you. You could also have pooling. Pooling is where you take the total market and you have all the rival firms that offer that same product, and you basically divide the market across those producers. The problem with both the gentleman's agreement and with pooling is that firms don't honor what they said they were going to do because there's such a huge incentive to defect. Meaning that there's a huge incentive to cheat, basically, and be able to charge a higher price for a product. Or, in some cases, grab the entire market by charging a slightly cheaper price. In either case, especially with the pooling, which comes to be the dominant way that this is done, in pooling, that you see these firms trying to come to some sort of nice agreement about how things are going to be, how the market's going to be divided, but then no firm actually listening to each other and doing what they said they were going to do. So because of all this cheating, what emerges in this time period are trusts. The trusts are designed only to get rid of this cheating. And the way that a trust is organized is it's basically a separate company that owns all of the companies that it covers. So in other words, the trust, its sole asset is ownership of all the other companies. And then so that those companies get something for having given up their company to the trust, they get shares of the trust. This also ensures that every company maintains its, that basically every company has a vested interest in honoring what their agreements were in terms of the price. And from page 308, what I quote from that is this device, the issue of the trust, was so successful as a means of centralizing control of an entire industry and so profitable to the owners of the stock The trust reformed in the 1880s and early 1890s to control the output of, and then it lists a whole bunch of different products. So without monopolies and other things, trusts were the way that you consolidated businesses, in the way that you stifled competition, in a way to help the economy grow, but also help the individual companies grow. The problem, however, was that these trusts were a matter of the public record. And what that means is that anyone can find out what exists. So, if everyone then knows what exists, it's hard to enforce things because states are going to find out what's going on and they're going to get grumpy about this anti-competitive behavior. So, what we do then is that you have to start to come up with an alternative to the trusts. Now, these trusts are basically being used for horizontal mergers, which we're going to look at here in the later slides here. But what these horizontal mergers represent are firms that produce a similar product all merging with one another. So we've got horizontal mergers, but then we also have vertical mergers, where companies try to own all the means of production. They're trying to own both what they do as a, like when you're making steel, you need a lot of bauxite. Well, they're gonna buy that bauxite. They're even gonna buy the power companies that are needed to produce all of that bauxite and all that fuel. And so by owning the means of production, and then by owning everything else, you can just go back into all the stages of production. So things start out with horizontal mergers. That becomes the first way in which things are consolidated. And that's happening between 1879 and 1893. So basically the 1880s, essentially. Railroads are using this a great deal. And it's a reflection of the fact that consumer demand is becoming more national and is becoming larger. Standard Oil, again, another example of a horizontal merger. Standard Oil being a company that expands in value to almost $10 billion, basically. The vertical mergers are seen after the horizontal mergers period. So you see this 1898 to 1904. This is at the time that Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And with his election, he becomes very anti-monopolistic. These vertical mergers are seen in the steel industry, where, again, the steel company could own the mines, they could own the railroads that transport the things. So they're trying to own all the stages of production of that product. During that first era, during the horizontal mergers time period, the 1880s, it culminates in the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which, as legislation from the Congress, had declared that it was illegal to have a contract or a combination in the form of a trust. So there were supposed to be no more trusts with the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Attorney General was charged with pursuing the cases. Unfortunately, it was the judges that had to decide how to enforce it, and the judges largely did not enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Supreme Court even went as far as to say that even if we did do anything about the Sherman Antitrust Act and got rid of trusts, this doesn't extend to mergers. So mergers were not what you were going to do and what were going to replace trusts. Mergers were seen as a way to reduce competition and allow greater profits to be earned. But largely to the most extent, the Sherman Antitrust Acts, although they were made as a reaction to the horizontal merger movement, the horizontal merger movement itself was not about getting monopoly power. It was the vertical mergers instead that were all about getting more monopoly power. Instead, the horizontal mergers, what they were designed to do was they were just designed to, essentially to try to merge companies such that you had some greater control over the pricing power, but it wasn't about one firm having all that power. Rather, it was more about how do you control the sharing of the wealth that comes from having a national customer base. What we see as we now turn to the 1900s, as it becomes the 1900s, is that you need individuals like Theodore Roosevelt and then later Woodrow Wilson to create the legislation that's going to get rid of the monopolies. And obviously the Europeans at this time were pretty much in favor of it as well. By 1911, only 2 large companies were broken up as a consequence of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that was Standard Oil and American Tobacco. And even when these places were broken up, they still did business. In some cases, they even made more money. It just looked a little different. Woodrow Wilson, seeing these gaps, these problems in the Sherman Antitrust Act, gets us the Clayton Act. And what it did is it forced the courts to take more seriously complaints made about there being mergers. And what the Sherman Antitrust Act, it didn't achieve very much, but as the bottom of page 317 highlights, what it did is it gave an entry point for the government and in turn society for being organized in how businesses are run and whether those businesses are working towards a good set of goals rather than just increasing their own profit. So that as businesses are becoming larger, what you're seeing here is that basically the government is being asked to intervene, I guess would be the best way to put it. The government is intervening to control businesses for the benefit of the public at large. And the Sherman Antitrust Act showed the government what worked and what didn't, such that when we get the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, we have much more of a stronger protection of consumers in the marketplace.